This is Bryan Orender, President of Charitable Advisors and publisher of the Not-for-Profit News. Thank you for joining us for this episode of the Frontline Perspectives podcast. Today, I'm excited to be joined by Professor Stephanie Hoffer. She is the first JGen chair in tax law at the IU Robert H. McKinney School of Law. And we're going to be talking about some things today that we don't usually get into very deeply. And in kind of the preparation, Stephanie was able to share a lot of really interesting information with me. So Stephanie, why don't we kind of start out with a big picture? And you've started a study of reaching back over a period of years, and I'll leave it there. I'll let you kind of tell us a little bit about the work you've been doing.
Thank you so much, Bryan. I really appreciate the invitation. I began this study a few months ago in response to a request from a journal that I write a piece about the way that Congress legislates during times of crisis. So what I did was pulled 20 years of legislation related to crises of all sorts. The big economic crises in 2004 and 8, as well as national news items like Hurricane Katrina, the 9/11 terrorist attacks, and smaller natural disasters as well, things like wildfires in California, flooding in the Midwest, and those kinds of events. And so I looked at these for the period beginning in the year 2000 and ending in the year 2020. And what I noticed was that over that time, Congress has tended to repeat many provisions from earlier legislation in later legislation. So I came into this study expecting to see a few provisions related to big businesses being repeated and expanded over the 20-year period. But what I actually observed was that, especially in the case of natural disasters, Congress does a lot of cutting and pasting from its prior legislation. For instance, for localized crises, almost always you'll see exemptions for payments to individuals who were hurt or killed. Things like estate tax benefits, allowing individuals to withdraw money from their retirement accounts. And of course, as you know, typically there are loosened rules for charitable contributions. And those provisions appear in the larger scale, full-on federal crises as well. So it's been a pretty interesting look at the legislation so far.
Very good. Yeah, you kind of name all those disasters and you think, wow, we have experienced kind of all that. And I know you're looking at things we would consider kind of national or bigger picture, and then also the local from our conversation. Well, how have these things kind of applied then to the charitable sector? We tend to think about all the money that flows to big corporations but how do you see that impacting the charitable sector?
It's really interesting. You know, it happens in a couple of ways, one of which I've looked at less, and that's in the form of tax-exempt bond financing. Those provisions appear in almost every bill, but they're relatively opaque, so I haven't dug into them much yet. For purposes of this study, I've been focusing primarily on expansion of the Section 170 deduction for charitable contributions. And that's actually pretty interesting. So beginning with Hurricane Katrina, really, Congress introduced some, innovative provisions. One of which, of course, was the expanded availability of the deduction. But in addition, it added in things like expansion of the deduction for the contribution of from businesses to charities of food stores. The contribution from businesses to charities of books. There were some additional provisions related to deduction of mileage by volunteers. And those things, which were introduced in the first bill related to Hurricane Katrina, were repeated in almost every subsequent piece of legislation related to a natural disaster that I looked at. So, for instance, everything that applied in the context of Hurricane Katrina was repeated subsequently for Hurricanes Rita, Wilma, Harvey, I'm sure I'm missing a couple, as well as, areas where you wouldn't expect it, like tornadoes in Kansas, for instance. So that's one thing that was pretty interesting to me. And a second thing about the repetitive nature of the legislation that interested me was that occasionally provisions that Congress has been repeating become permanent. And there's one example of this in the charitable orgs context, which is the exemption from individual income tax of disaster relief payments. So if a charitable organization makes a payment to an individual who's been affected by a disaster, that payment is now exempt from federal tax by statute, and that wasn't always the case. So although they appear to be one-off provisions at the time, these expansions of the charitable deduction and this 139 exemption are actually part of a recurring pattern of legislation. And so if you're thinking about the country in a broader context, or thinking about the role of charitable organizations in a broader context, you can't think just about the one piece of legislation. Instead, you have to look over time and say, well, how is this legislation affecting the organizations, affecting the donor base, and affecting the public generally?
You had mentioned then, if you're headed that way, from an advocacy standpoint, that the efforts that are kind of ongoing to increase the charitable contribution, or that all of those things, if they're successful in getting into one of these bills, it's likely that they'll be repeated then in subsequent bills.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So from an advocacy perspective, organizations that are hoping to change the structure of, for instance, the charitable deduction, or the definition of which organizations qualify for exemption, for instance, or what kinds of payments an organization can make, absolutely should be thinking about how to work that provision into disaster-related legislation. The pattern of recurrence is so strong that I feel rather comfortable saying that we can expect to see it continue. And I would go so far as to guess that we should expect to see the individual non-itemizer deductions continue, if not more broadly, at least in this context. So a couple of things about that. One is the study suggests that anybody who's hoping to change the face of these disaster-related pieces of legislation has to start early and well in advance of a pending disaster, because it's pretty clear that once Congress is presented with a disaster, it cuts and pastes whatever it had in the last bill. So it's acting with exigency in a time of crisis. This isn't the moment where legislative chambers are going to have a reasoned conversation with one another about whether this modification or that one is better. So that advocacy work, I think, has to start outside of a period of crisis. And the second thing I would say is the provisions in the legislation that have tended toward permanence often are, in their permanent form, tethered to a presidential declaration of disaster. So the Section 139 exemption is an example of this. That's the disaster relief payment. There are other things in the code that have gone in this direction. And so my suggestion is, in the course of advocacy, organizations really should make it clear, if it's true, that is, that the provision is beneficial not only in the disaster context, which may make it especially important, but also outside of that context, in part because the presidential declaration of disaster is reserved for truly disastrous events, charitable organizations deal with smaller local events on a daily basis, and there's no reason to think that those events are of any less importance to the individuals affected by them than the larger national events that garner presidential recognition. And I guess the second thing I would say, the second lesson I would draw from the study is that it's clear that charitable organizations are, in Congress's view, very important to disaster mitigation efforts. One thing that this study really brings to the fore for me is how much Congress relies on these organizations when it's providing disaster relief. If organizations are thinking of themselves in isolation or thinking of the disaster as a one-off event, that's missing a big part of the picture. Charitable organizations really are a part of the nation's disaster infrastructure. So when individual donors are making donations to organizations, they're directing where those federal subsidy dollars for disaster will go. And as multiple studies, not mine, but as other people's studies have suggested, the donor base can be affected by its locality, the donor's personal connections to the organization or cause, or even things like race or gender bias. And so it really then falls on the organizations themselves to recognize the role that they play in creating a fair distribution of resources in the disaster. So each organization in the context of disaster response should see part of its responsibility as making sure that its mission is inclusive, whatever that would happen to mean in the context of that organization, because Congress really is relying on these organizations in this context.
Very good. Yeah, that's interesting. I had not thought about it like that until we were, kind of in our preparation conversation there. So I think you did a great job kind of wrapping things up. We'll kind of land the plane here. I've been pleased to have Professor Stephanie Hoffer from the IU McKinney School of Law with us today. Thank you for joining us. We hope this discussion has given you some insights that you can apply this week. Thank you very much, Stephanie.
You're welcome. Thanks so much, Bryan.